It was the dead of night, sometime after 2 a.m., when the gas gauge dipped dangerously into the red. I was driving down Route 14, a stretch of highway that felt like it had been abandoned by God and man alike. The moon was a sliver in the black sky, barely lighting the empty fields and skeletal trees that lined the road. My car sputtered, a warning sign I couldn't afford to ignore. I should have filled up at the last gas station an hour back, but I'd been so focused on getting home that I'd brushed off the blinking low fuel light. Now, as the engine whined in protest, I cursed myself for my stupidity. I had no choice but to pull over. When the car finally died, I sat there gripping the wheel, staring at the dark ribbon of road ahead. The eerie quiet seeped into the car. No other headlights pierced the gloom. My phone had a single bar of service. I managed to send a quick text to my wife. Car out of gas. We'll call a AAA. Might be late. But when I tried calling, the line crackled and dropped. With a sigh, I grabbed the flashlight from the glove box and stepped out into the night. The air was cold and heavy, carrying the faint, earthy scent of damp soil. The nearest gas station, according to a sign I'd passed earlier, was about 2 miles ahead. It would be a long walk, but I didn't see any other choice. As I trudged down the shoulder of the road, the flashlight's beam jittered over cracked asphalt and tufts of weeds. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. The further I walked, the stronger the sense of unease became. It started as a vague prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the fields. Nothing moved, just endless rows of cornstalks swaying gently in the breeze. But I couldn't shake the feeling. About half a mile in, I spotted something ahead, what looked like a person standing at the edge of the road. Relief washed over me. Maybe someone else had broken down and we could figure this out together. I quickened my pace, calling out, "Hey, you okay?" No response. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The figure wasn't moving. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and its silhouette seemed off. My flashlight flickered, and in that split second, the figure vanished. I froze, heart hammering against my ribs. The beam of light swept over the area where the figure had stood, but there was no sign of it. No footprints in the dirt, no sound of retreating footsteps, just the endless rustling of the cornstalks. I told myself it had to be my imagination, a trick of the shadows. Forcing myself to move, I kept walking, now acutely aware of every sound. The creak of the windmill in the distance, the occasional snap of a twig, the steady thud of my heartbeat. The road stretched on forever, and I began to wonder if I'd missed the gas station altogether. Just as I was about to turn back, I spotted a dim light in the distance. It flickered weakly, like an old neon sign struggling to stay lit. The gas station was straight out of a horror movie, one of those ancient places that should have been torn down decades ago. The windows were grimy, the paint was peeling, and the sign above the pump read, "Harlow's Fuel," in faded, crooked letters. But at that moment, it was a beacon of hope. I approached the door, noting how the wooden steps groaned under my weight. Inside, a single bulb swung lazily from the ceiling, casting long, shifting shadows. The smell of oil and mildew hung thick in the air. Behind the counter sat a man, if you could call him that. He was gaunt, with sunken cheeks and eyes that gleamed too brightly under the dim light. His lips stretched into a smile that didn't quite reach those unnerving eyes. "Help you?" he rasped, his voice like dry leaves. I explained my situation, trying to ignore the way his gaze seemed to drill into me. He nodded slowly and said, "We got a can out back. Fill up your car, pay inside." He handed me an old, rusted gas can. The metal felt cold, almost wet as I took it. Without a word, I turned and walked back outside. The pump creaked as I filled the can. My hands trembled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The shadows seemed to shift around me, dark shapes darting just out of view, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. As I capped the can, I noticed something strange on the pump. Scratched into the metal were the words, "Don't trust him." I stumbled back, dropping the gas can. My pulse pounded in my ears. When I looked up, the man from inside was standing at the door, watching me. His grin was wider now, his teeth yellow and uneven. He raised a hand, beckoning me inside. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't just leave my car. Swallowing my fear, I forced myself to walk back toward the station. The man stepped aside as I entered, his gaze never leaving mine. "Cash or card?" he asked, his voice dripping with malice. "Card," I mumbled, fumbling in my pocket. The machine beeped as I slid my card, but the receipt never printed. The man tilted his head, that grotesque smile widening. "Looks like there's an issue. Why don't you come to the back? We'll sort it out." My throat went dry. The words scratched on the pump flashed through my mind. "Don't trust him!" But before I could respond, the man turned and disappeared through a door behind the counter. I hesitated, every fiber of my being screaming at me to leave. But the door swung open, revealing a narrow hallway bathed in flickering fluorescent light. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The hallway smelled of rot and decay. The walls were covered in deep gouges, like something had clawed at them. At the end of the hall was another door, slightly ajar. I pushed it open with trembling hands. Inside, the room was filled with strange, grotesque objects, animal bones tied together with string, jars of unidentifiable substances, and old photographs of people with their faces scratched out. On the wall, scrawled in what looked like blood, were the words, "You're next." I stumbled back, heart hammering, only to find the man standing in the doorway. His face was no longer human. His eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and his grin stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth. "You should have stayed in your car," he hissed, his voice a guttural snarl. I turned and ran, barreling past him into the hallway. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew thick with the stench of death. I burst through the front door and didn't stop running until I reached my car. Throwing the gas can into the trunk, I jumped in and locked the doors. The engine roared to life on the first try, as if it had never run out of gas. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The gas station was gone. Nothing but an empty lot and a rusted sign swinging in the wind.
Story number 2.
It was late October, the kind of night where the wind cuts like a blade and the darkness feels alive. I'd been on the road for hours, my eyelids heavy as my car ate up the miles. The dashboard glowed faintly, and the needle on the gas gauge hovered precariously above E. There wasn't a gas station for miles, at least none that my GPS had picked up. When the engine stuttered, I swore under my breath. I flicked on my hazard lights and coasted to the shoulder. The silence after the engine died was deafening, broken only by the distant howling wind. My phone was nearly dead, with no signal to call for help. I sat there for a moment, contemplating my next move. Then I spotted a faint light through the trees ahead, flickering like a dying candle. Desperate, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the frigid night. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the cracked asphalt and twisted branches overhead. The light seemed farther than it looked, but I pressed on, the sound of my boots crunching on gravel the only company. As I approached, the source of the light came into focus. A small, run-down gas station sitting alone in the woods, its sign swinging in the wind. Clem's Gas and Goods, it read, though half the letters were missing or burned out. The building looked ancient, its wooden exterior warped and stained, the windows coated in grime. The pump island had a single rusted pump that looked like it hadn't been operational in decades. But I wasn't in a position to be picky. I pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling weakly. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of motor oil and something else, something metallic, like blood. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. No answer. The shelves were sparsely stocked with dusty cans and faded candy wrappers. In the corner, a flickering TV played static, casting ghostly shadows across the walls. Behind the counter stood an old man. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were sunken, rimmed with dark circles. He looked up as I approached, his cracked lips curling into a smile that felt all wrong. "Need gas?" he rasped, his voice dry and brittle. "Yeah," I replied. "My car's out on the road. Can I borrow a gas can?" He nodded slowly, reaching under the counter to produce a battered metal can. "Take what you need. Pay when you're done." Relieved, I thanked him and headed back outside. The pump groaned in protest as I turned the handle, and I swore I heard a faint whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. Shaking it off, I filled the can and started back toward my car. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere in the woods. I froze, flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam swept across the trees, but I saw nothing, just shadows and the rustling of leaves. But the sound came again, louder this time. Closer. I broke into a run, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I clutched the gas can. The growling grew louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. Something was following me, something big. When I finally reached my car, I slammed the gas can onto the ground and fumbled with the cap. My hands shook as I poured the fuel into the tank, glancing nervously over my shoulder. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel eyes on me, watching from the darkness. I jumped into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. Relief flooded me as I peeled out, leaving the gas station and whatever was in the woods behind. But the nightmare wasn't over. About a mile down the road, the headlights flickered. The car shuddered violently, and the engine cut out again. I slammed the steering wheel, cursing my luck. Then I noticed something chilling. The road behind me was completely dark. The headlights of the gas station were gone, swallowed by the void. I sat there, paralyzed as the silence pressed in. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw movement. A figure stood in the middle of the road, barely visible in the faint moonlight. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted to one side as though studying me. My heart raced as I locked the doors and tried the ignition again. The figure began to move, lurching forward in jerky, unnatural strides. It didn't walk, it dragged itself closer, its limbs bending in ways that defied anatomy. Finally, the engine roared to life. I floored the gas pedal, the tires squealing as I sped away. The figure disappeared into the darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't gone. I drove for what felt like hours, the road stretching endlessly before me. My mind raced, replaying the events at the gas station. Something wasn't right about that place, or the man inside. And then I saw it. Up ahead, the same gas station loomed, its sign creaking in the wind. My heart sank. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop. This wasn't possible. I had driven miles. There was no way I'd ended up back here. The old man was standing outside now, his pale face illuminated by the dim light. He raised a hand and beckoned me forward. That unsettling smile plastered across his face. "No," I whispered, gripping the wheel. "No, no, no." I threw the car into reverse, spinning the tires as I backed away. But the road behind me had vanished, replaced by a wall of trees. The only way forward was through the gas station. With no other choice, I drove back into the lot. The old man stepped aside as I parked, his eyes following me as I got out. "You shouldn't have left," he said softly, his voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "It doesn't like that." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the woods behind the station. I turned, and my blood ran cold. The figure was there, standing just beyond the tree line, its head tilted, its glowing eyes fixed on me. "What is that?" I whispered. "It's hungry," the old man replied. "And now so are you." Before I could react, then the man's body began to contort, his limbs stretching and twisting as his mouth split open in a grotesque grin. He let out a guttural laugh that echoed in my ears as the shadows around the gas station came alive, writhing and slithering toward me. I ran, but the darkness consumed everything. The last thing I heard was the sound of my own screams, swallowed by the night.
Story number 3.
The sun had long since set when I found myself driving down a desolate country road, the kind of road that felt forgotten by the modern world. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere and was now hopelessly lost, my GPS spinning aimlessly. The gas gauge hovered just above empty, and with no phone signal to guide me, I was left praying for a miracle. A gas station, a diner, anything. The car began to sputter, and dread settled in my chest. I eased it onto the gravel shoulder just as the engine died. The silence that followed was suffocating. I sat there for a moment, staring at the dark road ahead, when I saw a faint glow in the distance. It was soft, flickering, like a lantern swaying in the breeze. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out into the cold night. The air was thick and damp, carrying a strange metallic tang. I followed the glow down a narrow dirt path that cut through a dense forest. The trees loomed overhead, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The light led me to a clearing, where an old gas station stood like a relic of a bygone era. Its sign, barely legible under the grime, read Miller's Fuel. The building was small, with peeling paint and boarded-up windows, but the gas pumps looked functional. Relieved, I approached the station. The light I'd seen was coming from a lantern hanging near the door. Its flame flickered weakly, casting dancing shadows across the cracked pavement. I stepped inside, and a bell chimed softly overhead. The interior was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with dusty cans and strange, unlabeled jars. Behind the counter sat an old man, his back hunched and his head bowed. His white hair was sparse, and his skin was pale, almost gray. "Evening," I said, trying to sound calm. The man looked up slowly, his milky eyes locking onto mine. "Help you?" His voice was raspy, like dry leaves scraping together. "My car ran out of gas a few miles back," I explained. "Do you have a gas can I can borrow?" The man nodded, his movements deliberate and unsettling. He reached under the counter and produced an old metal gas can. It was dented and rusted, but it would do the job. "You'll want to hurry," he said, sliding the can toward me. "Night's not safe around here." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stared at me with those cloudy eyes, a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, crossing his face. "Be quick," he repeated. I didn't need to be told twice. I took the gas can and hurried back outside. The pump whined as I filled the can, and the nozzle was ice cold, as though it had been left out in the dead of winter. As I worked, I noticed the forest around me had gone eerily silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just the faint hiss of the pump. When I turned back toward the station, the old man was standing in the doorway, watching me. His face was blank, but his eyes burned with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I waved awkwardly and started down the path, the gas can swinging at my side. The lantern's light dimmed behind me as I re-entered the forest. The trees seemed closer now, their twisted trunks forming shadowy figures that loomed on either side of the path. I hadn't gone far when I heard it, a faint guttural growl coming from somewhere in the darkness. I froze, gripping the gas can tightly. The growl came again, louder this time, accompanied by the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no reply, only the steady crunch of leaves growing closer. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light that did little to pierce the darkness. Suddenly, a branch snapped behind me, and I spun around, heart pounding. The path was empty, but I could feel something watching me, its gaze heavy and malevolent. I turned and broke into a run, the gas can banging against my leg with every step. The growling grew louder, closer, until it was almost on top of me. I risked a glance over my shoulder and nearly tripped. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch too far. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but its eyes glowed an unnatural yellow, locking onto me with predatory intent. I screamed and ran faster, the weight of the gas can threatening to slow me down. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but I couldn't stop. The thing was gaining on me, its ragged breaths echoing in my ears. When I finally burst out of the forest and reached my car, I fumbled with the gas can, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unscrew the cap. The growling had stopped, but I knew it was still there, watching from the shadows. I poured the gas into the tank as quickly as I could, spilling half of it onto the ground. Jumping into the driver's seat, I turned the key. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then roared to life. Relief flooded through me as I sped away, leaving the gas station and the forest behind. But as I drove, a sinking feeling settled in my gut. Something wasn't right. The road stretched on endlessly, the trees blurring together in the glow of my headlights. I glanced at the gas gauge. It was empty again. My stomach dropped. I had just filled it. How could it be empty? The car sputtered, the engine whining in protest. I slammed my fists against the steering wheel as the vehicle coasted to a stop. The forest loomed on either side of the road, silent and menacing. I stepped out, heart pounding, and turned back toward the direction of the gas station. The road behind me was gone, replaced by a wall of trees. Panic surged through me as I spun around, searching for any sign of the path I'd taken. That's when I saw it. Standing in the middle of the road, bathed in the dim glow of my taillights, was the same figure from the forest. Its elongated limbs twitched unnaturally as it began to move toward me. I stumbled backward, my flashlight slipping from my grip. The figure's face came into view, and I wished it hadn't. Its skin was stretched tight over its skull, its mouth a gaping black void. The yellow eyes burned into mine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though it was pulling the very life out of me. I turned and ran blindly into the trees, branches clawing at my clothes and tearing at my skin. The figure's growls followed me, closer and closer, until they seemed to surround me. I tripped over a root and fell hard, the wind knocked out of me. When I looked up, the figure was there, looming over me. It reached out with impossibly long fingers, its mouth stretching into an unholy grin. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was its eyes, cold, glowing, and full of hunger.
Story number 4.
The rain was coming down in sheets as I drove along the lonely, winding road. It was the kind of storm that swallowed sound, leaving nothing but the relentless drumming of water on the roof and the occasional crack of thunder. I had been driving for hours, my eyes bleary from the glare of my headlights reflecting off the slick pavement. I was exhausted, hungry, and dangerously low on gas. The dashboard light blinked. "Low Fuel. Panic began to set in as I scanned the empty road ahead. My phone had no signal, and the idea of being stranded in the middle of nowhere during a storm sent a shiver down my spine. Then, as if summoned by sheer desperation, a faint glow appeared in the distance. I leaned forward, squinting through the rain. It was a gas station, a small dilapidated building with a single pump and a flickering neon sign that read, "Open 24 hours." Relief washed over me as I pulled into the lot, the tires splashing through deep puddles. The station looked ancient, its wooden siding warped and discolored. The pump was rusted, and the price per gallon on the faded sign seemed decades out of date. But at that moment, I didn't care. Gas was gas. I stepped out into the storm, yanking my hood over my head. The rain was icy, soaking through my clothes almost instantly. I tried the pump, but it didn't respond. Cursing under my breath, I made my way to the station's door. A bell jingled weakly as I stepped inside. The air was musty, tinged with the smell of mildew and something metallic. The shelves were sparsely stocked with dusty cans and faded candy wrappers, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly. Behind the counter sat a man, tall and gaunt, his skin pale as wax. His eyes were sunken, and his lips pulled into a thin, humorless smile. "Evening," he said in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. "Hi," I replied, trying to sound casual. "I need gas, but the pump isn't working." The man's smile widened slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Old pump. Needs activation from in here." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "How much you need?" "Just enough to get to the next town," I said, pulling out my wallet. The man's bony hand reached out, his fingers brushing mine as he took the cash. His touch was cold, almost clammy, and it sent a chill up my arm. He punched a few buttons on the register, then nodded toward the door. "Pump's ready." I mumbled a thank you and hurried back outside. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the air felt heavier somehow, as if the storm had left something behind. I began pumping the gas, glancing nervously at the dark woods that surrounded the station. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Just as the tank was nearly full, I heard it. A low, guttural noise, like a growl, coming from the edge of the forest. I froze, the nozzle still in my hand. The sound came again, louder this time, and closer. My heart pounded as I scanned the tree line, but I saw nothing. Hastily, I replaced the nozzle and climbed back into the car, locking the doors behind me. The engine roared to life, and I pulled back onto the road without looking back. But as I drove, the sense of unease only grew. The woods seemed darker now, the trees pressing in on either side like a tunnel. The rain had stopped, but the road was shrouded in a thick fog that clung to the ground like smoke. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something chasing me. The road stretched on endlessly, and I began to wonder if I'd taken a wrong turn. The gas station was long gone, but there were no signs of civilization. No houses, no streetlights, not even another car. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the car as it rolled over uneven pavement. Then, out of nowhere, the headlights illuminated something on the road ahead. A figure. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just feet from the person standing in the middle of the road. My heart was in my throat as I stared at them. A woman, drenched from head to toe, her long, dark hair hanging limply over her face. She wore a tattered dress that clung to her body, and her bare feet were caked with mud. I rolled down the window slightly, just enough to speak. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. She didn't move. She just stood there, her head tilted slightly to one side as if studying me. A shiver ran down my spine. "Do you need help?" I asked again, louder this time. Still, she didn't answer. Instead, she raised one hand and pointed toward the woods. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Something about her was deeply wrong. Her presence felt oppressive, as if the air around her was heavier. I rolled up the window and shifted the car into reverse, planning to go around her. But when I looked back at the road, my blood ran cold. She was there, standing directly behind my car, her face just inches from the rear windshield. Her eyes, milky white and unblinking, bored into mine, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. I screamed, slamming the car into drive and flooring the gas pedal. The woman disappeared from view as the car surged forward, but I didn't stop. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, my knuckles white as I sped down the road. The fog grew thicker, the headlights barely cutting through the murk. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, terrified that she would appear again. My pulse was racing and my breath came in short, panicked gasps. Then the car began to sputter. No, 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 I muttered, glancing at the gas gauge. It was empty. How? I had just filled the tank. The car rolled to a stop, the engine dying with a final pitiful whine. I sat there in the silence, my chest heaving as I tried to think. I reached for my phone, but it was dead, the screen black and unresponsive. A soft tapping sound broke the silence. My heart stopped as I turned toward the passenger side window. The woman was there, her face pressed against the glass, her smile wider now, impossibly wide. Her teeth were jagged, yellowed, and far too many. Her hands were splayed against the window, her fingers unnaturally long and thin. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stared, her eyes boring into mine with a hunger that made my stomach churn. I scrambled for the door handle, throwing it open and stumbling out into the fog. I ran blindly, the damp air clawing at my lungs. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, steady and deliberate. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The last thing I remember is tripping over something, a root, a rock, I don't know, and falling hard onto the ground. As I lay there, dazed, I felt a cold hand wrap around my ankle, pulling me into the darkness.
Story number 5.
The wind howled as I drove along the old highway, the kind of road you only find on paper maps. It was supposed to be a shortcut to the cabin I'd rented, but the endless stretches of empty road were making me doubt my decision. The gas gauge was dipping toward empty, and the night was growing darker, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow the world whole. I hadn't seen a single car for miles, and I was starting to wonder if I was completely alone out here. That's when I saw it, a sign, illuminated by my high beams, pointing down a narrow dirt road. It read, "Sundown Gas and Service, 1 mile." Relief flooded through me. I turned onto the road, the tires crunching against gravel. The path wound through dense trees, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out even the faintest hint of starlight. After what felt like forever, the forest opened up to reveal a small gas station, its neon sign flickering weakly. The place looked like it hadn't seen a customer in decades. The building was squat and weathered, the paint peeling in long strips. The pump was one of those ancient analog models, the kind you'd see in an old movie. But at that moment, it might as well have been an oasis in the desert. I pulled up next to the pump and got out. The air was cold, carrying a faint metallic smell that made me wrinkle my nose. A bell jingled as I opened the station's door. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the walls lined with dusty shelves stocked with outdated products. A small TV in the corner played static, the faint hum adding to the oppressive silence. Behind the counter sat a man. He was thin and pale, his face gaunt like he hadn't eaten in days. He didn't look up as I approached, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the counter. "Evening," I said, forcing a smile. "I need a fill-up." The man's head lifted slowly, and I was struck by the emptiness in his eyes. They were a pale gray, almost colorless, and they seemed to look through me rather than at me. "Pump's self-service," he said in a flat voice. "Cash only." I nodded, pulling out a few bills and sliding them across the counter. His hand hovered over the money for a moment before he snatched it up, his fingers curling around it like claws. "Be careful out there," he muttered as I turned to leave. I hesitated. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. He just stared at me, his lips twitching as if he wanted to say more but couldn't. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating, and I hurried back outside, eager to be gone. I began pumping the gas, glancing nervously at the surrounding woods. The trees seemed to press closer than they had before, their twisted branches forming dark shapes that swayed in the breeze. The feeling of being watched crept over me, and I couldn't shake the sensation that something or someone was just out of sight. As I replaced the nozzle, I noticed something strange. My car's windows were fogged up, despite the chilly air. I leaned closer, peering inside, and froze. There were handprints on the glass. Dozens of them, smeared across the windows as if someone had pressed their hands against the glass over and over again. My stomach turned as I realized they weren't mine. The prints were small, childlike, and they seemed to shimmer faintly under the dim light of the station's sign. I spun around, my heart racing. The lot was empty, the woods were silent, but the oppressive feeling of being watched had intensified, pressing against my chest like a weight. I jumped into the car, locking the doors behind me. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the lot, gravel spraying behind me. The road stretched ahead, a narrow strip of dirt cutting through the endless forest. I drove faster than I should have, the headlights illuminating the path just ahead. The farther I went, the thicker the fog became until it felt like I was driving through a dream. The trees on either side seemed to blur together, their shapes twisting unnaturally in the periphery of my vision. Then, in the middle of the road, I saw them, a group of children. They stood in a line, their heads tilted slightly as they watched my car approach. Their clothes were old-fashioned, tattered, and dirty, and their faces were pale, almost translucent in the headlights. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just feet from the group. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The children didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stared, their eyes dark and empty. I rolled down the window a crack. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice trembling. One of the children, a girl with long, matted hair, stepped forward. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette on strings. She raised a hand and pointed to the woods. "Don't go back," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "It doesn't like when you leave." "What?" I stammered, but before I could say more, the children vanished. They didn't walk away. They didn't fade. They were just gone, as if they'd never been there. My pulse thundered in my ears as I pressed the gas pedal, the car lurching forward. I didn't care about the fog, the winding road, or anything else. I just needed to get out. But no matter how far I drove, the gas station appeared again. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. But as I pulled closer, the flickering neon sign confirmed it. Sundown Gas and Service. My blood ran cold. The pump, the building, even the lone light bulb illuminating the lot, it was all the same. I didn't stop. I kept driving, pushing the car harder, the needle on the gas gauge dropping dangerously low. But after what felt like hours, I was back again. The gas station stood like a silent sentinel, waiting for me. Panic overtook me. I yanked the wheel, turning onto a narrow side road that plunged deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser, their twisted limbs forming a tunnel that swallowed the car. The fog thickened, swirling around the vehicle like a living thing. The road ended abruptly, and I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. In front of me was a clearing, and in the center stood the same group of children. They were closer now, their faces clearer in the dim light. Their skin was pale and waxy, their eyes hollow black pits. The girl with the matted hair stepped forward again, her head tilting at an unnatural angle. "It doesn't like when you leave," she said again, her voice echoing strangely. Behind them, a shape emerged from the shadows. It was massive, its body hunched and misshapen. Its limbs were long and spindly, ending in claws that scraped against the ground. Its face, if it had one, was hidden in the darkness, but its eyes burned with an unnatural red glow. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, and the children stepped aside, their mouths stretching into wide, unnatural grins. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I threw the car into reverse, slamming the pedal to the floor. The tires screeched as the car careened back down the road, the headlights flickering wildly. The creature's roar followed me, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones. When I finally burst back onto the main road, the gas station was gone. The forest thinned, and the faint glow of a town appeared on the horizon. But even now, as I sit here in the safety of my home, I can feel its eyes on me. It doesn't like when you leave.
Story number 6.
The night was cold, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones no matter how tightly you wrapped yourself. I was driving through the back roads of Pennsylvania, miles from the nearest town. My trip was supposed to be a quick overnight stay with friends, but I had lingered too long, and now I was racing the clock to get home before exhaustion took over. The road was narrow and winding, bordered by dense woods. My car's headlights cut through the darkness, but it felt like the shadows were closing in. The dashboard blinked at me. "Great," I muttered, glancing at my phone. No signal. Of course. A few miles later, as panic began to set in, I spotted a faint glow ahead. A gas station materialized out of the darkness, its single pump and flickering sign a beacon of hope. The place looked ancient, the paint on the building peeling and the windows covered in grime. The sign above the pump read, "Morgan's Filling Station, Est was 1953. I pulled in, relief flooding me. The pump looked older than my car, but I didn't care. As I stepped out, a faint whiff of something metallic and rotten hit me. I chalked it up to the station's age and approached the pump. The nozzle wouldn't budge. I looked around for instructions, then noticed a faded sign taped to the pump. "Pay inside before pumping." I sighed, heading for the station's door. The bell above the entrance jingled as I stepped inside, and a wave of stale air greeted me. The interior was dimly lit. the shelves lined with outdated snacks and dusty soda bottles. A lone figure stood behind the counter, a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes, wide and unblinking, fixed on me the moment I entered. "Hi," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need some gas." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if she were listening to something I couldn't hear. Her lips finally parted. "How much?" $20 worth." She nodded, her movements slow and deliberate, and rang up the sale on an ancient cash register. As I handed her the money, her cold fingers brushed against mine. A shiver ran through me. "Careful out there," she murmured, her voice low and raspy. I forced a smile and backed away, eager to get out of the oppressive atmosphere. As I turned toward the door, something caught my eye. A wall covered in faded Polaroid photos. Each one was of a person standing in front of the gas station, their expressions blank, their eyes staring directly into the camera. Beneath each photo was a name and a date. The most recent one read, Jake Walters, October 5th, 1997. I felt a chill run down my spine. Shaking it off, I stepped outside and started pumping gas. The woods surrounding the station were eerily quiet. Not even the sound of crickets broke the silence. The shadows between the trees seemed to move, shifting with the faintest breeze. I tried to focus on the pump, willing the numbers to climb faster. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as it grew louder, I realized it was words. My name. Mark. I whipped around, the nozzle slipping from my hand. There was no one there. The station's lights flickered, casting strange, wavering shadows across the lot. My pulse quickened as I scanned the area, but everything was still. "Just your imagination," I muttered, fumbling to finish pumping the gas. I jumped back into the car and locked the doors, the sound of the locks clicking oddly comforting. As I pulled onto the road, the unease from the station clung to me like a second skin. The forest seemed darker now, the trees pressing closer to the road. The wind had picked up, howling through the branches like a mournful wail. Then I saw it in the rearview mirror. A figure was standing in the middle of the road, just barely illuminated by my taillights. It was the woman from the gas station, her pale face framed by her long, dark hair. Her mouth was moving, but I couldn't hear what she was saying. I slammed on the gas, speeding away. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, but she was gone. The road twisted and turned, and I began to feel like I was driving in circles. The same trees, the same bends, it all looked identical. My headlights caught a sign ahead and my stomach dropped. Morgan's Filling Station, ST 1953. I couldn't believe it. Somehow I had looped back to the gas station. The pump, the building, even the faintly glowing sign, they were all exactly as I'd left them. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. I drove past the station, determined not to stop. The road stretched on, the darkness growing thicker. But after what felt like an eternity, I saw it again. The gas station. My heart was pounding now, my breathing ragged. I pulled into the lot, hoping to find an explanation, anything that could make sense of what was happening. The station looked exactly as it had before, down to the nozzle I'd left hanging from the pump. I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin. The station's door creaked open, and the woman emerged. She stood in the doorway, her head tilted, her unblinking eyes fixed on me. "You can't leave," she said softly. "What?" I stammered, taking a step back. "It won't let you." Before I could respond, the shadows around the station began to move. They slithered across the ground, pooling together in the center of the lot. From the darkness, something emerged, a massive amorphous shape, its surface rippling like oil. The air grew heavy, the metallic scent from earlier now overwhelming. My body felt paralyzed as the thing unfolded itself, towering over me. It had no face, but I could feel its gaze, cold and penetrating. The woman stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "It needs someone to stay." "What are you talking about?" I shouted, my voice cracking. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked back into the station, the door slamming shut behind her. The thing in the shadows began to move, creeping toward me with an unnatural grace. I ran to the car, fumbling with the door handle. As I climbed inside and started the engine, the thing reached out, its inky tendrils scraping against the windows. The car lurched forward, tires squealing as I sped away. The road ahead seemed endless, the darkness thicker than ever. I drove for what felt like hours, my hands shaking on the wheel. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Finally, the forest gave way to open fields, and the lights of a small town appeared in the distance. Relief washed over me as I pulled into a brightly lit diner. the first sign of life I'd seen in hours. Inside, the warmth and noise were a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the road. I slumped into a booth, ordering coffee and trying to calm my nerves. As I sipped the steaming cup, I glanced up at the wall behind the counter. My stomach dropped. There, among dozens of Polaroids, was a picture of me. Beneath it, written in shaky handwriting, was today's date.
Story number 7.
The storm rolled in fast, turning the evening sky into a swirling mass of black clouds. I was driving back from a client meeting in a small Pennsylvania town, the kind of place where time seemed to move slower. The plan had been simple: finish the meeting, grab dinner, and head home. But the meeting ran long, and now I was on a desolate highway with rain pounding against my windshield. The gas gauge blinked a warning. "Of course," I muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. I'd meant to refuel in town, but the thought had slipped my mind. Now I was miles from anywhere, the headlights illuminating little more than sheets of rain and the occasional reflective road sign. Just when I began to consider pulling over and waiting for the storm to pass, I saw a dim light in the distance. As I got closer, the light resolved into a neon sign, flickering weakly. Red Ridge Gas, open 24 hours. Relief flooded me. I pulled into the lot, parking under the awning of a single weathered gas pump. The station itself was small and old-fashioned, the windows clouded with grime. The rain pelted the roof above, creating a constant rhythmic drumming. I got out, the icy rain soaking me instantly. The pump was ancient, the kind you see in history books, and when I lifted the nozzle, nothing happened. I glanced around for a sign of life, but saw no one. My only option was to go inside. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped into the station. The interior smelled musty, like damp wood and forgotten corners. Rows of outdated snacks and dusty sodas lined the shelves. A counter sat at the far end, and behind it was a man, if you could call him that. He was thin, almost emaciated, with skin that seemed stretched too tightly over his frame. His eyes were sunken, and his face was so pale it looked almost blue. He didn't smile or greet me, just stared. "I need to get gas," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man tilted his head, his movements slow and deliberate. "Pump's broken, but I got a can of gas in the back." He stepped out from behind the counter and motioned for me to follow. Every instinct in my body screamed to leave, but the storm outside and my nearly empty tank convinced me otherwise. He led me to a door at the rear of the station, opening it to reveal a staircase descending into darkness. "Gas is down here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated. "You keep gas in the basement? It's where we store things. Don't want no thieves taking it." The logic didn't make sense, but before I could argue, he started down the stairs. The thought of being stranded in the storm was worse than following him, so I reluctantly trailed behind. The basement was cold and damp, the smell of mold thick in the air. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow light over the room. Rusted tools and machinery were scattered across the floor, along with old crates and barrels. The man shuffled to a corner, rummaging through a pile of containers. As I waited, I noticed something on the wall, a series of photographs. They were faded and yellowed, but I could make out the faces of men and women. Each photo had a date written below it. There's flackheaders, and my blood ran cold when I realized the most recent one was from 2 weeks ago. "Here," the man said, startling me. He held up a red gas can. "This'll get you where you're going." I nodded, eager to leave, but as I reached for the can, I noticed his hands. They were covered in scars, deep, jagged lines crisscrossing his skin. "What happened to your hands?" I asked before I could stop myself. The man's eyes narrowed. "Accidents. This place, it don't let you leave easy." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he shoved the can into my hands and gestured toward the stairs. "You best get moving." I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, desperate to get back to my car. The storm had intensified, the wind howling like a living thing. I popped the gas cap and began pouring the fuel, the smell of gasoline mixing with the rain. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I looked up at the station's window. The man was there, standing perfectly still, his pale face barely visible through the fogged glass. Finally, the tank was full. I jumped into the car and started the engine, my tires splashing through puddles as I sped back onto the highway. The rain made it hard to see, but I was too focused on putting distance between myself and that station to care. It wasn't long before I noticed something strange. The highway should have led me to the next town, but the road stretched endlessly into darkness. The storm began to fade, replaced by an eerie stillness. The air grew colder and a thick fog rolled in, obscuring everything beyond the headlights. I glanced at the gas gauge. It was full when I left the station, but now it was dropping rapidly. Panic set in as the car began to sputter. The engine died, and I coasted to a stop on the shoulder. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. Then I saw it. In the rearview mirror, a figure emerged from the fog. It was the man from the gas station, his gaunt frame backlit by the faint glow of my taillights. He was holding something, a Polaroid camera. I fumbled with the keys, trying to restart the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. The man grew closer, his footsteps impossibly loud on the asphalt. "Stay back!" I yelled, but my voice sounded weak, swallowed by the oppressive fog. He raised the camera, the flash momentarily blinding me. When my vision cleared, he was gone. I sat there trembling, unsure of what to do. The fog began to lift, revealing my surroundings. I wasn't on the highway anymore. I was back at the gas station. The building looked older now, its windows shattered, the sign hanging by a single rusted chain. My car wouldn't start, so I stepped out, my heart hammering in my chest. As I approached the station, I saw something new. A Polaroid photo was taped to the door. It was of me, standing by my car, my face pale and terrified. Beneath the photo was a date, today's date. I turned to run, but the fog closed in again, thicker than before. Out of the shadows, I saw them, the figures from the photographs in the basement. They moved toward me, their faces blank, their eyes dark voids. The last thing I heard was the click of a Polaroid camera.
Story number 8.
The wind howled through the narrow mountain pass, a bone-chilling wail that echoed across the empty highway. I was driving home from a weekend hiking trip, tired but content, until a glance at the dashboard sent a wave of anxiety crashing over me. The fuel gauge was nearly empty, the needle hovering just above. I cursed under my breath. The last station had been miles ago, and I hadn't thought to stop. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the world cloaked in a deep blue twilight. Shadows stretched long and eerie across the road as I pressed forward, hoping against hope for a gas station. Finally, I saw it. A small, dilapidated building on the side of the road, a rusted sign swinging in the wind. Grant's Fuel and Supply. The neon lights flickered faintly, the word "open" barely legible. I pulled into the lot, my tires crunching over gravel. The place looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. The single pump was ancient, its paint peeling, and the numbers on the meter faded to near illegibility. Still, it was my only option. Stepping out of the car, I was immediately struck by the stillness. There were no crickets, no rustling of trees, just the soft hiss of the wind. As I approached the pump, I realized it had no card reader. A sign hung from the side, scrawled in barely legible handwriting, "Pay inside." The interior of the station was even worse than the outside. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and oil. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a sickly yellow glow over the room. Behind the counter sat an old man, his face obscured by shadow. His head tilted slightly as I entered, his eyes following me with unsettling precision. "Need gas," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't reply immediately, just stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Finally, he nodded toward an ancient register. "20'll get you enough to make it out of here." I handed him the cash and turned to leave, but something caught my eye. A wall behind the counter, covered in photos. Dozens of them, all Polaroids, each showing a different car parked at the station. Some were old, the cars long outdated, but others looked newer, eerily similar to mine. "Nice collection," I said, hoping to break the tension. The old man's lips curled into the faintest smile, but he didn't respond. I hurried back outside, filling my tank as quickly as I could. The wind had picked up, carrying a faint metallic scent. My unease grew with every passing second, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When the pump clicked off, I jumped back into the car and sped away, eager to leave the creepy station behind. The road stretched endlessly before me, the darkness swallowing everything outside the reach of my headlights. The fuel gauge now read full, but the sense of relief was short-lived. A mile or two down the road, I noticed something strange. The forest around me seemed denser, the trees pressing closer to the road. The pavement, once smooth, was now cracked and uneven, as if it hadn't been maintained in decades. I dismissed it as paranoia, convincing myself I was just tired. But then the car began to sputter. "No, no, no," I muttered, glancing at the gas gauge. It was empty. Impossible. I had just filled the tank. The engine coughed one final time before dying completely, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Of course. I sat there for a moment, staring out into the darkness, trying to figure out what to do. That's when I saw the lights. Headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as they approached. Relief washed over me as a truck came into view, its old frame rattling as it pulled to a stop beside my car. The driver rolled down his window, revealing a man in his 50s, his face lined with deep wrinkles. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yeah," I said, stepping out of the car. "Ran out of gas. I don't understand. I just filled up a few miles back." The man frowned. "You sure about that?" "Yeah, Grant's Fuel and Supply." His expression darkened. "Grant's closed down years ago." I felt a chill run through me. "No, it's open. I was just there. Some old guy runs it." The man shook his head. "Ain't no old guy. Grant died in a fire back in '86. Burned the whole place down." My stomach dropped. "That's not possible. I was there. I paid him." The man stared at me for a long moment, then glanced at the road behind him. "Look, there's a town about 10 miles up. I can give you a ride." Normally, I wouldn't accept a ride from a stranger, but something about the situation made me desperate. I nodded, grabbing my backpack before climbing into the truck. We drove in silence for a while, the radio playing faint static. The man kept glancing at the rearview mirror, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "You feel that?" he asked suddenly. "Feel what?" "The air. It's wrong. Too cold for this time of year." Now that he mentioned it, I realized the temperature had dropped significantly. My breath was visible, frosting the window slightly. A faint fog had begun to settle over the road. As we rounded a bend, the truck's headlights caught something in the distance, a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was the old man from the gas station. The driver slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. "What the hell?" he muttered, staring at the figure. The old man didn't move. He just stood there, his head tilted slightly, his dark eyes locked on us. "Stay in the truck," the driver said, opening his door. "No, wait," I called, but he was already out. The driver approached the figure cautiously, shouting something I couldn't hear over the pounding of my heart. The old man didn't respond, didn't move. Then, in one horrifying moment, the old man lunged forward, his movements unnaturally fast. The driver screamed as the shadows seemed to come alive, wrapping around him like smoke. I scrambled to the driver's side, fumbling with the keys, but they were gone. The old man's face appeared in the window, his eyes hollow pits of darkness. He smiled, his teeth sharp and glinting in the dim light. I screamed, kicking open the passenger door and running into the woods. The branches tore at my skin and the air burned in my lungs, but I didn't stop. I could hear footsteps behind me, impossibly fast, and a low, guttural growl that didn't sound human. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing, collapsing to my knees. The forest was silent again, the oppressive cold lifting. When I looked back, there was no sign of the old man or the truck. I eventually found my way to the town, my story met with skeptical glances and forced smiles. No one believed me, but they all gave me the same advice: never stop at Grant's Fuel and Supply.